The week following James's meeting with the Queen passed in a whirlwind of unprecedented activity. The official announcement of David's Victoria Cross Award had been made, and as predicted, the media response was immediate and overwhelming. Reporters camped outside James's apartment building. Photographers tried to catch him arriving at work, and his phone rang constantly with interview requests from newspapers, television programs, and radio stations. James had initially tried to maintain his normal routine, reporting for his morning cleaning duties as usual. However, the presence of media crews at the castle gates made this impossible. His supervisor, Mrs. Helen Crawford, called him into her office on Wednesday morning with an expression of bemused confusion. "James," she said, gesturing to the window, where camera crews were visible in the distance. "I've been fielding calls from journalists all morning asking about you. Apparently your son is some sort of war hero?" The surreal nature of the situation wasn't lost on James. For 15 years, Mrs. Crawford had known him simply as a reliable member of the cleaning staff. Now she was learning about his family's extraordinary circumstances from newspaper reporters rather than from him directly. "Yes, ma'am," James replied. "David is receiving the Victoria Cross next week. I apologize for not mentioning it earlier. The information was classified until the official announcement." Mrs. Crawford sat back in her chair, studying James with new interest. "The Victoria Cross? Good heavens, James. Do you realize what this means? You're the father of a national hero. The press attention alone will be enormous." James had begun to understand the magnitude of the attention, but he was still struggling to accept his role in the story. In every interview request, every newspaper article, he was identified not just as David's father, but as a longtime member of the royal household staff. His own service was being examined and discussed in ways that made him deeply uncomfortable. "Mrs. Crawford," James said hesitantly, "I'm concerned about the disruption this might cause to castle operations. I don't want my personal situation to create problems for the rest of the staff or interfere with our duties." Mrs. Crawford smiled, and James was surprised to see what looked like pride in her expression. "James, in all my years managing this department, I've never had a staff member become national news for reasons like this. The castle administration is thrilled by the positive attention. Her Majesty herself has expressed particular pleasure that one of her longtime servants is receiving recognition for his family's service." The mention of the Queen brought back memories of their private meeting, which James had not shared with anyone. The warmth and genuine interest she had shown continued to amaze him, and knowing that she was pleased by the attention surrounding his family made the media circus slightly more bearable. On Friday morning, 3 days before the award ceremony, James received an unexpected visitor at his apartment. David stood at his door, thinner than James remembered and moving with a slight limp, but smiling with the same boyish grin that had charmed teachers and neighbors throughout his childhood. "Hello, Dad," David said simply, and James pulled his son into an embrace that lasted several minutes. All the words James had rehearsed, all the expressions of pride and gratitude he had planned, seemed inadequate for the moment. Having David safe and home was enough. Over the next several hours, father and son talked more openly than they had in years. David shared details about the mission in Afghanistan that hadn't been included in the official reports. The fear he had felt, the split-second decisions that had determined life and death, and the overwhelming responsibility of knowing that other people's lives depended on his actions. "Dad," David said as they sat in James's small living room, "during the worst moments of that firefight, when I thought I might not make it out, I kept thinking about you, about the way you've always done your duty, no matter what that duty required. It sounds strange, but remembering you mopping floors with the same pride you showed during ceremonial duties, that's what kept me going." James felt a lump form in his throat. The idea that his simple approach to work had somehow inspired his son during the most dangerous moments of his life was both humbling and profound. "David," James replied, "I've spent my whole life in service roles, following orders, doing what was expected. What you did in Afghanistan, making those split-second decisions, taking responsibility for other people's lives, that requires a kind of courage I'm not sure I possess." David shook his head firmly. "Dad, Courage isn't about big dramatic moments. It's about showing up every day and doing what's right, even when no one notices or thanks you for it. You've been teaching me that my entire life. On Sunday morning, the day before the award ceremony, David and James attended a quiet church service together. James had hoped for privacy, but word of their presence had somehow leaked, and they found themselves surrounded by well-wishers and photographers even in this sacred space. The vicar, an elderly man who had known James for years, adjusted his sermon to include themes of service, sacrifice, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. After the service, as they walked home through the Windsor streets James had traveled for 15 years, David stopped suddenly and turned to his father. "Dad, tomorrow everything changes for both of us. After the ceremony, we'll never be anonymous again. People will recognize us, expect things from us, want us to be symbols of something larger than ourselves." James nodded, having wrestled with the same realization throughout the week. "Are you ready for that responsibility?" David considered the question seriously. "I think so, but I wanted to ask you, are you ready? You didn't choose this attention the way I chose military service. This is happening to you because of my actions." James looked at his son, seeing not the war hero the newspapers were celebrating, but the thoughtful young man he had raised to consider others before himself. Even in the midst of his own transition from anonymity to fame, David was worried about his father's comfort and well-being. "Son," James said, putting his arm around David's shoulders, "I've spent my entire adult life serving something larger than myself. First the military, then the crown, always trying to be part of something important and meaningful. Tomorrow, when I watch you receive the Victoria Cross, I'll finally understand what I've been serving all these years. Not buildings or institutions or traditions, but the values that produce men like you." Monday morning dawned bright and clear, as if the weather itself wanted to honor the occasion. James put on his best civilian suit, the same one he had worn, to meet the Queen, and prepared for the most important day of his life. In a few hours he would stand in Buckingham Palace as his son received the highest honor the British military could bestow. As they traveled to London together, both father and son were quiet, lost in their own thoughts about the ceremony ahead and the life changes it would bring. James thought about his conversation with the Queen, her words about true service and the values that define character. He thought about the years of quiet morning shifts, mopping floors and maintaining standards, never knowing that someone was watching and learning from his example. When their car pulled through the gates of Buckingham Palace, James saw crowds of people lining the streets, waving flags and holding signs supporting David and other military heroes. For the first time since this extraordinary week had begun, James felt a deep sense of rightness about the attention and ceremony surrounding his son's award. David had earned this recognition through courage and sacrifice that most people could barely imagine. But more than that, he had earned it by carrying forward values of service and duty that had been passed down through generations of ordinary people doing their jobs with pride and dedication. As James prepared to enter the palace where his son would be honored by the Queen, he finally understood that his own years of faithful service had been preparation for this moment, not just as David's father, but as a representative of all, the quiet heroes who serve without recognition or reward, simply because it's the right thing to do. The rest of James's workday passed in a blur of conflicting emotions and racing thoughts. He mechanically completed his cleaning duties, but his mind was elsewhere, trying to process the extraordinary morning he had experienced. Fellow staff members noticed his distracted state, but James couldn't bring himself to explain what had happened. The news was still confidential, and besides, how could he possibly put such overwhelming developments into words? That evening, James sat in his small apartment just outside Windsor, staring at the official report for the 100th time. The formal military language couldn't quite capture the reality of what David had endured, but reading between the lines, James could imagine the terror, confusion, and desperate determination his son must have felt during those crucial 40 minutes in Afghanistan. He tried calling David's base, but was told that his son was still in the medical facility and not available for personal calls. The frustration of not being able to share this momentous news with the person it concerned most was almost unbearable. James wanted to hear David's voice, to tell him how proud he was, to somehow bridge the distance between them with words of love and admiration. Unable to concentrate on television or books, James found himself walking through his small flat, picking up photographs of David at various stages of his life. There was 5-year-old David in a miniature soldier costume, grinning toothlessly at the camera. 10-year-old David at a school Remembrance Day ceremony, standing solemnly at attention in his cadet uniform. 18-year-old David on his graduation day from basic training, looking impossibly young and eager in his fresh uniform. Each photograph told part of the story of how a cheerful, ordinary boy had grown into a man capable of extraordinary heroism. James wondered if he had seen signs of this potential during David's childhood, or if the capacity for such courage had developed during his military training and deployment experiences. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of explosions, helicopters, and his son's face streaked with dirt and determination. James woke several times, checking his alarm clock and calculating how many hours remained until his appointment with the Queen. The weight of the approaching meeting pressed down on him like a physical burden. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching James's nervous mood. He had requested the day off from his regular duties, citing a family emergency, which was technically true, though hardly adequate to describe the situation. He spent an hour deciding what to wear, finally settling on his best civilian suit, the one he wore to church and important occasions. Standing before his bathroom mirror, James practiced introducing himself, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "Your Majesty, I'm James Mitchell." The words sounded strange in his own voice. How did one address the Queen in informal conversation? Should he wait for her to speak first? What topics would be appropriate to discuss? At precisely 2:30, James presented himself at the staff entrance to Windsor Castle, carrying the official identification that would grant him access to areas of the building he had never seen, despite his 15 years of service. The security officer who checked his credentials looked at him curiously, clearly wondering why a maintenance worker needed access to the private royal apartments. An elegantly dressed woman in her 50s met James at the appointed location and introduced herself as Lady Catherine Hartwell, one of the Queen's private secretaries. Her manner was warm but professional, and she seemed to understand James's nervousness. "Mr. Mitchell, Her Majesty is looking forward to meeting with you," Lady Hartwell said as she led him through corridors filled with priceless artwork and historical artifacts. "She's quite moved by your son's story and your family's record of service." The walk to the Queen's private study seemed both endless and far too short. James tried to calm his racing heart by focusing on the magnificent paintings and tapestries that lined the walls, but his anxiety only increased as they approached their destination. Lady Hartwell stopped before an ornate door and turned to James with a reassuring smile. "Her Majesty prefers informal conversations to formal presentations. Simply be yourself and speak naturally. She's very easy to talk with once you get past the initial nervousness." The door opened to reveal a surprisingly cozy room filled with comfortable furniture, family photographs, and the warm light of table lamps. It looked more like someone's private living room than a royal office. The Queen rose from a chair beside a small fireplace, and James's first thought was how much smaller and more human she appeared than he had expected. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, extending her hand with a warm smile. "Thank you for coming to see me. Please, sit down and make yourself comfortable." James shook her hand, marveling at the surreal nature of the moment. After 15 years of serving in her castle, seeing her from a distance during official functions, he was now sitting across from her in her private study, being treated as an honored guest rather than a member of staff. "I wanted to speak with you before the ceremony next week," the Queen continued, settling back into her chair. "Your son's actions in Afghanistan have captured the attention of the entire nation, and rightfully so. But I was equally interested to learn about the family that raised such a remarkable young man." James felt his nervousness begin to ease slightly. The Queen's manner was indeed warm and informal, more like a concerned grandmother than an intimidating monarch. "Your Majesty, I'm still trying to process what David accomplished. The bravery described in that report, It's almost impossible to believe it's the same boy I taught to ride a bicycle. The Queen smiled at this. I imagine it must be overwhelming for any parent. Tell me, what was David like as a child? Did he show signs of this kind of courage early on? James found himself relaxing further as he talked about David's childhood, sharing stories of his son's determination, his sense of fairness, and his protective instincts toward younger children and animals. The Queen listened intently, asking occasional questions that showed genuine interest in understanding David as a person, rather than just as a war hero. And what about his decision to join the military? The Queen asked. Was that influenced by your own service? I never pushed him toward military life, James replied honestly. But I think he saw how much pride I took in serving, even in small ways. I always told him that there's honor in any honest work, whether you're leading troops into battle or mopping floors in a royal castle. The Queen's eyes showed particular interest at this comment. Speaking of your service, Mr. Mitchell, I understand you've been with us here at Windsor for 15 years. Your supervisors speak very highly of your dedication and professionalism. James felt a flush of embarrassment. I've simply tried to do my job to the best of my ability, Your Majesty. Whether I was standing ceremonial guard or cleaning corridors, it all felt like serving the crown. That attitude is exactly why I wanted to meet with you, the Queen said. True service isn't about the glamour or recognition of the role. It's about bringing excellence and pride to whatever task you're given. You've exemplified that principle throughout your career and clearly passed those values on to your son. As their conversation continued, James found himself sharing thoughts and feelings he had never expressed to anyone else. His pride in David's achievements, his fears during each deployment, and his quiet satisfaction in his own years of faithful service. The Queen listened with the attention of someone who genuinely understood the sacrifices made by military families. Mr. Mitchell, the Queen said, after nearly an hour of conversation, I want you to know that your son's heroism reflects not just his own character but the values instilled by his family. When I present him with the Victoria Cross next week, I'll be honoring not just his courage in Afghanistan, but the lifetime of service your family has given to this country. James felt tears forming in his eyes. To hear such words from the monarch, he had served for so many years, was almost overwhelming. Your Majesty, serving has always been its own reward. I never expected recognition or thanks. Which is precisely why you deserve both, the Queen replied firmly. True servants of the crown don't seek recognition. They simply do what's right because it's right. That's a rare quality in today's world, and one that should be celebrated. The Queen stood, signaling that their meeting was drawing to a close, but her expression suggested there was something more she wanted to share. Mr. Mitchell, there's one final matter I'd like to discuss with you. Following the award ceremony, there will undoubtedly be changes in your life. Media attention, public interest, perhaps opportunities you haven't considered. I want you to know that whatever path you choose, you will always have my personal gratitude and support. James rose as well, still processing the extraordinary hour he had just experienced, meeting the Queen as an equal, sharing personal stories about his son, feeling heard and valued in a way he had never imagined possible. It all seemed like something from another person's life. Thank you, Your Majesty, James said, his voice thick with emotion. This conversation has meant more to me than I can express. To know that David's sacrifice is understood and appreciated at the highest levels, it helps make sense of everything our family has endured. As Lady Hartwell appeared to escort him back through the castle, the Queen took. Before the three officers could take their leave, Commander Hayes paused and turned back to James. Mr. Mitchell, there's one more thing, something that makes this situation rather extraordinary, even by military standards. James, still clutching the official report, looked up expectantly. What could be more extraordinary than his son receiving the Victoria Cross? During his recovery, your son was visited by several high-ranking officials who wanted to personally thank him for his actions. One of these visitors was General Sir Patrick Morrison, who currently serves as the Queen's private secretary's military advisor. During their conversation, David mentioned his father's service and his current position at Windsor Castle. Colonel Richardson stepped forward to continue the explanation. General Morrison was intrigued by the coincidence of Victoria, Cross recipient's father, serving at the very castle where the award ceremony would traditionally be planned. He made some inquiries about your service record and was impressed by what he found. James couldn't imagine what, in his unremarkable service record, could have impressed a general. He had been a solid soldier and was now a reliable member of the castle staff, but nothing about his career seemed particularly noteworthy to him. "Mr. Mitchell," Mr. Thompson said, "your personnel file shows 15 years of exemplary service at Windsor Castle, preceded by 12 years of military service with commendations for leadership and dedication. More importantly, it shows that you've never missed a day of work, never received a disciplinary action, and have consistently received the highest ratings from your supervisors." James shifted uncomfortably. He had always simply done his job to the best of his ability. The idea that someone had been studying his record and found it impressive seemed unlikely. What struck General Morrison, Commander Hayes continued, was a comment from your current supervisor. When asked about your character, she said that you approach every task, whether ceremonial guard duty or maintenance work, with exactly the same level of professionalism and pride. She mentioned that you've never complained about your assignment changes and have often volunteered for additional duties during staff shortages. The praise made James uncomfortable. He had been raised to believe that doing your job properly was simply expected, not something deserving of special recognition. The idea that his supervisors had noticed and appreciated his attitude was gratifying, but also embarrassing. General Morrison brought this to Her Majesty's attention, Colonel Richardson said. The Queen was apparently quite moved by the story of a father and son who both embody the values of service and sacrifice, albeit in very different circumstances. James felt a flutter of nervousness. The thought that the Queen had been discussing him personally was both thrilling and terrifying. What did it mean that she had taken a personal interest in his family's story? "Mr. Mitchell," Commander Hayes said, his voice taking on a more formal tone, "I have been authorized to inform you that Her Majesty would like to meet with you privately before the award ceremony. She wishes to personally thank you for your years of faithful service and to discuss your son's heroism." The words hit James like a physical blow. A private audience with the Queen. In all his years of service, first as a soldier, and then as a royal guard, he had never imagined such a possibility. Even during his ceremonial duties, he had been part of the background, one face among many in formal formations. "When would this meeting take place?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow afternoon," Mr. Thompson replied. "You would be excused from your regular duties, of course. The meeting is scheduled for 3 o'clock in the Queen's private study." James tried to imagine himself in the Queen's private study, sitting across from the monarch he had served from a distance for so many years. What would they talk about? What should he wear? How should he prepare for such an unprecedented encounter? "Sir," James said hesitantly, "I'm not sure I understand why Her Majesty would want to meet with me personally. Surely the ceremony honoring David would be sufficient recognition for our family." Commander Hayes smiled slightly. "Mr. Mitchell, the Queen has spent her entire life surrounded by people who serve her in various capacities. She has developed a keen appreciation for those who serve with genuine dedication rather than mere obligation. Your record suggests that you fall into the former category. Additionally," Colonel Richardson added, "Her Majesty believes that David's heroism didn't develop in a vacuum. She's interested in meeting the man who helped shape such character and values." The weight of responsibility James felt was enormous. Tomorrow he would be representing not just himself but his son, his family, and somehow the values they all shared. The thought of disappointing the Queen or saying something inappropriate terrified him. "What should I expect during this meeting?" James asked. "How should I prepare?" "Be yourself," Mr. Thompson advised. Her Majesty specifically requested an informal conversation. She wants to hear about your son from your perspective, to understand the family environment that produced such a remarkable young man. Commander Hayes nodded in agreement. "The Queen has read David's service record and the reports from Afghanistan, but she wants to hear about him as a person, as your son. She's particularly interested in how military families cope with the stress of dangerous deployments. James thought about the sleepless nights when David was deployed, the constant worry that lived in the back of his mind, the way he had learned to read between the lines of his son's carefully censored letters. These were experiences he had never shared with anyone, private fears and concerns that seemed too personal for public discussion. "Mr. Mitchell," Colonel Richardson said gently, "Her Majesty understands the sacrifices made not just by soldiers, but by their families. She wants to acknowledge your role in David's story and to thank you personally for the years of service your family has given to the Crown." The three officers began gathering their materials, preparing for their departure. James realized that his life had been completely transformed in the space of a single conversation. Yesterday, he had been an anonymous maintenance worker looking forward to a quiet morning of mopping floors. Now he was the father of a national hero with a private audience scheduled with the Queen of England. "One final thing," Commander Hayes said as they prepared to leave. "After tomorrow's meeting with Her Majesty and following the award ceremony, there will likely be opportunities for you to speak publicly about your son and your family's military service. These opportunities are entirely voluntary, but they can be meaningful ways to honor David's sacrifice and to inspire others." James nodded, though the thought of public speaking filled him with dread. He had always been more comfortable in the background, doing his job quietly and efficiently. The idea of being thrust into the spotlight as a representative of military families seemed overwhelming. As the three men walked away, their footsteps echoing down the corridor, James stood alone, with his mop and bucket, the official report still clutched in his hand. The quiet morning routine that had defined his life for so many years was ending forever. Tomorrow he would sit with the Queen and talk about his son, the hero. Next week, he would stand beside that same son as he received the highest honor his country could bestow. The transformation was almost too much to comprehend, but as James looked down at the report describing David's courage, he felt a deep certainty that everything was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Commander Hayes reached into his jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing official government markings. "Mr. Mitchell, what I'm about to tell you must remain confidential until the official announcement is made. Your son's actions saved the lives of 7 British aid workers, including 2 who were seriously wounded and wouldn't have survived another day in captivity." James accepted the envelope with trembling hands, still trying to process the magnitude of what he was hearing. His son, the boy who had once been afraid of thunderstorms and had cried when their family dog died, had risked everything to save strangers in a foreign land. The intelligence reports indicate that David's unit was outnumbered 15-1, Colonel Richardson continued. When the extraction helicopter was damaged by enemy fire, he made the decision to create a diversion, drawing the hostile forces away from the landing zone. He held his position for over 40 minutes, allowing the helicopter to be repaired and the civilians to be safely evacuated. Mr. Thompson stepped closer, his expression grave. What makes this even more remarkable is that David had already been wounded early in the engagement. He had taken shrapnel to his left shoulder and had been shot in the leg, but he refused to fall back. The other members of his unit reported that he seemed to become more determined as the situation grew more desperate. James thought about all the times David had shown that same stubborn determination as a child, refusing to give up on learning to swim despite nearly drowning twice, insisting on finishing a difficult puzzle even when it took him weeks, never backing down from a challenge once he had committed to it. These childhood traits had apparently evolved into the kind of courage that saved lives. "There's something else," Commander Hayes said, his voice dropping slightly. During the firefight, David's radio was damaged, so he had no way of knowing whether the civilians had been successfully evacuated. For all he knew, his sacrifice might have been in vain, but he continued fighting anyway. It wasn't until hours later, when a recovery team reached his position, that he learned everyone had made it out safely. The image of his son, wounded and alone, fighting against overwhelming odds without even knowing if his actions were successful, brought tears to James's eyes. He wiped them away quickly, embarrassed by his emotional response in front of these distinguished officers. "Don't apologize for your feelings, Mr. Mitchell," Colonel Richardson said gently. "Every man here understands what it means to be a father, and every military officer understands what your son accomplished." Commander Hayes nodded toward the envelope in James's hands. "That contains the preliminary report of the action, declassified, for family notification purposes. You'll find that your son credited his actions to lessons learned from his father about never abandoning your post and always putting duty before personal safety." James's hands shook as he opened the envelope and began reading. The military language was formal and precise, but between the lines he could see the chaos, fear, and determination that had characterized those crucial 40 minutes in Afghanistan. The report described David's tactical decisions, his accurate fire that kept enemy forces pinned down, and his refusal to retreat even when his ammunition ran low. According to his commanding officer, Mr. Thompson added, when the recovery team found David, he was still at his position, still watching for enemy movement, even though he had lost consciousness twice from blood loss. His first question when he woke up wasn't about his own condition, but whether the civilians had made it home safely. The pride James felt was almost overwhelming. This was his son, the boy he had raised, carrying forward the values they had discussed over dinner tables and during long walks around their neighborhood. But mixed with the pride was a deep sadness that David had been forced to prove these values in such a terrible situation. The Queen herself requested to be briefed on the details of the action, Commander Hayes continued. She specifically asked about David's family background and his father's service record. When she learned that you were currently serving at Windsor Castle, she expressed a particular interest in meeting both of you during the award ceremony. James looked up from the report, surprised. "Her Majesty knows I work here?" "Mr. Mitchell," Colonel Richardson said with a slight smile, "the Queen knows more about her staff than you might imagine. She was informed that one of her longtime servants was the father of a Victoria Cross recipient, and she expressed admiration for the family's continued dedication to service." The thought of meeting the Queen under these circumstances seemed surreal to James. In his 15 years at Windsor Castle, he had seen her many times but had never been introduced personally. The idea of being presented to her as the father of a war hero, rather than simply as part of the castle staff, was both thrilling and terrifying. "There will be significant media attention," Mr. Thompson warned. "The Victoria Cross is awarded so rarely that David's story will be front-page news across the country. You should prepare yourself for reporters seeking interviews, photographers wanting pictures, and general public interest in your family." James thought about his quiet life, his routine morning shifts, his anonymous existence among the castle staff. All of that was about to change dramatically. The privacy he had always valued would be replaced by public scrutiny and attention he had never wanted or sought. "We can arrange for security if needed," Commander Hayes offered, seeming to read James's concerns. "The military takes care of its heroes and their families. David's sacrifice has earned him honor, but it's also earned your family protection and support." The mention of sacrifice brought James back to the reality of his son's injuries. How serious are his wounds? Will he be able to continue his military career? "He'll make a full recovery," Colonel Richardson assured him. "The doctors expect him to be cleared for duty within 6 months, though given his new status as a Victoria Cross recipient, he'll likely be offered different assignments, possibly training roles or ceremonial duties that don't involve combat. Deployment." James wondered how David would feel about that. His son had always been drawn to the most challenging assignments, the missions that tested his skills and courage. Would he be satisfied with safer roles, or would he miss the intensity and purpose of special operations work? "Mr. Mitchell," Commander Hayes said, checking his watch, "we need to return to London for briefings, but we wanted to deliver this news personally. Your son will be contacted directly once he's medically cleared for travel. The official announcement will be made in 3 days, and the ceremony will be scheduled for the following week." As the 3 men prepared to leave, James realized that his quiet morning routine had been shattered forever. In the space of 20 minutes, his entire world had changed. His son was a hero. He was about to meet the Queen as an honored guest rather than a servant, and their family was about to become part of British military history. The mop and bucket beside him suddenly seemed like relics from another life entirely. The 3 men rounded the corner with purpose in their stride, their polished boots creating a sharp contrast against the soft swishing of James's mop. James glanced up briefly, noting the crisp military bearing of the approaching figures, but quickly returned his attention to his work. He had learned long ago that acknowledging every passing officer or official could be seen as presumptuous for someone in his current position. The man in the center wore the distinctive uniform of the Special Air Service, his beret bearing the famous winged dagger insignia that commanded respect throughout the British military. His companion wore the dress uniform of a high-ranking army officer, medals gleaming on his chest even in the dim morning light. The third man was in civilian clothes, but his bearing and the deference shown to him by the others suggested significant authority. James continued mopping, moving his bucket aside as the group approached. He expected them to walk past, engaged in whatever important business had brought them to the castle at such an early hour. Instead, the footsteps slowed, then stopped completely just a few feet away from where he worked. "Excuse me," came a voice, with the crisp accent of military authority. "Are you James Mitchell?" James straightened, surprised to hear his name spoken by someone he didn't recognize. He turned to face the three men, mop still in hand, water dripping slightly onto the floor he had just cleaned. "Yes, sir. I am." The SAS officer stepped forward, his eyes studying James's face with an intensity that made the older man slightly uncomfortable. James Mitchell, formerly of the 3rd Battalion Royal Regiment of Fusiliers before joining the Royal Guard. "That's correct, sir," James replied, wondering how this stranger knew his military background. His service record from before his appointment to the Royal Guard was not something typically discussed in his current position. The civilian-dressed man whispered something to the SAS officer, who nodded slightly before returning his attention to James. "And your son is David Mitchell, currently serving with Special Forces." A chill ran down James's spine. Why were these men asking about David? His mind immediately went to the worst possibilities. Had something happened to his son during a mission? Was this how families were notified of casualties in the Special Forces community? "Sir, is David all right? Has something happened?" James asked, his voice betraying the worry that suddenly gripped him. The SAS officer raised a hand in a calming gesture. "Your son is fine, Mr. Mitchell. More than fine, actually. That's why we're here." James felt his knees go slightly weak with relief. David was safe. But if that was the case, why were these men seeking him out at his workplace, asking questions about his family? "I'm Commander William Hayes, SAS," the officer continued. "This is Colonel Richardson from Army Headquarters and Mr. Thompson from the Ministry of Defense. We need to speak with you about your son's recent actions in Afghanistan." The mention of Afghanistan sent another wave of concern through James. David's letters had mentioned his deployment there, though the details were always vague due to security restrictions. James had learned not to ask too many questions about his son's work, understanding that some things couldn't be shared even with family. "What about his actions, sir?" James asked, setting his mop aside and giving the men his full attention. Commander Hayes exchanged glances with his companions before continuing. 3 weeks ago, your son participated in an operation to rescue a group of captured British aid workers. The mission was considered extremely dangerous with minimal chances of success and high probability of casualties. James listened intently, his heart beginning to pound. This was the kind of information David never shared in his letters, the reality of his dangerous work that James could only imagine. "The operation required volunteers only," Colonel Richardson added, stepping forward. "No soldier was ordered to participate due to the extreme risk involved. Your son not only volunteered immediately, but when the mission encountered unexpected complications, he single-handedly held off enemy forces while the rescue team extracted the hostages." "According to the reports," Mr. Thompson said, speaking for the first time, "your son's actions under fire were nothing short of extraordinary. He sustained multiple injuries but refused medical attention until every civilian was safely evacuated." James felt a mixture of pride and terror wash over him. Pride in his son's courage and dedication, terror at how close he had come to losing him. How badly was he injured? "He's recovering well," Commander Hayes assured him. "He'll be returning to the UK within the week. But Mr. Mitchell, the reason we're here isn't just to inform you of his actions. Your son's heroism has not gone unnoticed at the highest levels. The three men stood straighter, their expressions becoming more formal. James sensed that whatever they were about to tell him was the real reason for their unexpected visit. David Mitchell is to be awarded the Victoria Cross for his extraordinary bravery and selfless service, Colonel Richardson announced. It's the highest military honor our nation can bestow, and it hasn't been awarded to a living recipient in over 20 years. James felt the world tilt slightly around him. The Victoria Cross, the medal he had read about in military histories, awarded to soldiers who had shown the most exceptional courage in the face of enemy fire. His son, the boy he had taught to ride a bicycle and helped with homework, was going to receive the highest honor the British military could give. The ceremony will take place at Buckingham Palace, Mr. Thompson continued. Her Majesty the Queen will personally present the award. It will be a state occasion with full military honors. James struggled to process the information. His son, a hero, a Victoria Cross recipient. It seemed impossible, and yet looking at these three serious men, seeing their respect and admiration, he knew it was real. Mr. Mitchell, Commander Hayes said, his voice taking on a more personal tone, your son spoke of you often during his recovery. He wanted to make sure you knew that everything he learned about duty, honor, and service came from watching you. He specifically mentioned how you've served the crown with dignity in every role you've been given, never complaining, never considering any honest work beneath you. James felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. David had noticed. Despite the distance, despite the different paths their military service had taken, his son had been watching, learning, taking inspiration from his father's example. The weight of the moment settled on James's shoulders. His son was coming home a hero, and somehow in ways he was only beginning to understand. His own quiet service had played a part in shaping the man who had shown such extraordinary courage. As he stood there in his maintenance uniform, mop and bucket beside him, James realized that his morning routine was about to be interrupted by something far more significant than he could ever have imagined. The early morning mist hung over Windsor Castle like a gray blanket, and James Mitchell pushed his mop bucket down the marble corridor with the same steady rhythm he had maintained for the past 15 years. His Royal Guard uniform was pristine, pressed to perfection, but today he wasn't standing at attention beside the Queen's quarters or escorting visiting dignitaries. Today, like many others recently, he was cleaning floors. At 42, James had served the crown longer than most of the younger guards who now held the prestigious posts he once occupied. His graying temples and the slight stoop in his shoulders told the story of a man who had given his best years to duty, honor, and service. The irony wasn't lost on him that while tourists outside the castle walls snapped photos of guards they assumed lived glamorous lives, he was here at 5 a.m. mopping the same corridors he had once patrolled with pride. The water in his bucket rippled as he moved, reflecting the ornate ceiling above. James remembered when he first arrived at Windsor, fresh from military training, his chest swelling with pride every time he put on the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat. Those were the days when he stood motionless for hours, a living statue, protecting the royal family, feeling like he was part of something greater than himself. But times had changed. Budget cuts meant fewer ceremonial positions and more practical duties. Younger guards were preferred for the visible roles, while veterans like James found themselves assigned to maintenance, cleaning, and behind-the-scenes work. It wasn't what he had imagined when he took his oath of service, but James approached even this humble task with the same dedication he had always shown. The sound of his mop against the floor echoed through the empty hallway. In a few hours, this same corridor would be bustling with activity. Staff members rushing to their duties, officials heading to meetings, perhaps even members of the royal family passing through. But now, in these quiet morning hours, James felt a strange peace. There was something meditative about the repetitive motion, the gradual transformation of a dirty floor into something pristine and worthy of the castle's grandeur. As he worked, James's mind wandered to his son David, who was serving overseas with a special forces unit. The boy had followed in his father's footsteps, choosing military service, but had taken a different path. While James had chosen the ceremonial life of a royal guard, David had opted for combat training and special operations. They wrote to each other regularly, though David's letters were often heavily redacted due to the classified nature of his work. James paused to wring out his mop, watching the dirty water drain back into the bucket. He couldn't help but think about the contrast between his current reality and the expectations people had of royal guards. Visitors often asked him about the excitement, the glamour, the close encounters with royalty. They didn't ask about the early morning cleaning shifts, the sore feet from standing at attention for hours, or the loneliness of a job that required you to be seen but not heard, present but invisible. The grandfather clock at the end of the corridor chimed 6 times. James quickened his pace slightly. The castle would begin to wake up soon, and he wanted to finish this section before the day staff arrived. He had always taken pride in his work, regardless of what that work entailed. Whether he was standing guard during a state dinner or mopping floors before dawn, he did it with the same attention to detail and commitment to excellence. His thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of footsteps echoing from another corridor. Unusual for this time of morning, but not unheard of. Sometimes security personnel made early rounds, or kitchen staff arrived before their scheduled shifts to prepare for special events. James continued his work, the rhythmic swishing of the mop creating a steady soundtrack to his solitary morning routine. The footsteps grew closer, and James could hear voices, low, serious conversations that suggested official business rather than casual early morning chatter. He glanced up briefly, noting that the voices seemed to be heading in his direction, but returned his attention to his task. In his years of service, he had learned that curiosity about official business was not encouraged among the staff, regardless of their rank or position. As he moved his bucket to the next section of the corridor, James reflected on how much his life had changed since his early days as a guard. Back then, every day brought the possibility of excitement, of being part of history in the making. Now his days were predictable, quiet, and largely unnoticed. But there was dignity in this work too, he reminded himself. Someone had to maintain the standards of the castle, ensure that every surface worthy of royal presence was kept in perfect condition. The voices were getting closer now, and James could make out at least 3 different speakers. Their conversation was too quiet to understand, but their tones suggested urgency, importance. He focused on his mopping, keeping his head down and his movements steady. In his position, it was important to be present but unobtrusive, to do his job without interfering with the more significant business of others. James had always been good at making himself invisible when necessary. It was a skill that served him well in both his ceremonial duties and his current maintenance role. He had perfected the art of being thoroughly professional while remaining completely in the background, allowing others to conduct their business without distraction or interruption. The morning light was beginning to filter through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Soon the castle would be fully awake, filled with the sounds and activities of another day. But for now, in these last few minutes of quiet morning peace, James continued his methodical work, unaware that his routine morning was about to be interrupted in a way that would change everything he thought he knew about his place in the world. As he reached for his mop to tackle the final section of the corridor, the approaching footsteps suddenly stopped just around the corner. James could sense a presence, could feel eyes watching him, but he continued his work with the same steady professionalism that had defined his entire career. Whatever official business was taking place nearby, it had nothing to do with a maintenance worker mopping floors in the early morning hours.